The Galactic Empire controlled an estimated 3.2 billion habitable star systems. It maintained roughly 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers, each one 1.6 kilometers in length, plus approximately 50 Super Star Destroyers, including the Executor, a vessel nearly 17.6 kilometers long. Total warship inventory across all classifications, approximately 1.7 million vessels. The Death Star alone housed 1.7 million military personnel, 400,000 maintenance droids, and 250,000 civilians. One station, 2.35 million souls. Against that, the Rebel Alliance had roughly 2,000 capital ships at its absolute peak, and that peak came before the Battle of Yavin, before they'd won a single major engagement. At Yavin itself, they sent somewhere between 19 and 32 fighters to destroy a moon-sized battle station. The research record flags an internal contradiction in the sources on that exact number, so take the precise figure with some caution. What isn't in dispute, they sent X-wings and Y-wings, and almost all of them died. One capital ship for every 850 Imperial warships. One Rebel fighter for every 4,000 Imperial fighters. No planetary industrial base. No territorial tax revenue. No secure logistics corridor. Their flagship at the Battle of Scarif, the Profundity, was a converted civilian governance tower from the Mon Calamari city of Nystullum. They couldn't build warships. They could only borrow, salvage, or be gifted them. By every measurable metric of conventional warfare, the Rebel Alliance should have been destroyed in weeks. The fact that they weren't, that they eventually won, isn't really a story about Rebel strength. It's a story about how the most powerful military force in galactic history systematically dismantled itself, one catastrophic command decision at a time. That's the thesis. Now let's prove it. Start with the Battle of Yavin, because Yavin is where the official narrative diverges most sharply from what actually happened on a tactical level. The Rebel assault plan was direct. Fly into a trench along the Death Star's surface, fire 2 proton torpedoes into a thermal exhaust port 2 meters wide, and hope the shot triggers a chain reaction that destroys the reactor. 2 meters, the length of a standard door. University of Arizona Space Systems engineer Roberto Ferfaro, analyzing the design from an actual engineering standpoint, called venting heat through open exhaust ports in a zero-pressure environment lazy, terrible design. That's not a fan wiki's opinion. That's a credentialed space systems engineer describing the Empire's flagship weapon as an engineering embarrassment. Though even that framing may be too generous to the Empire. When Rogue One recontextualized the exhaust port's origins, it established that Imperial engineer Galen Erso deliberately built the flaw into the station's design. If that's accurate, and current canon treats it as such, then the Death Star wasn't destroyed because of bad engineering. It was destroyed because the Empire built its most critical military asset with an embedded saboteur and never detected him. That's not an engineering failure. That's a counterintelligence catastrophe. But here's what makes Yavin even harder to defend as an Imperial performance. The Rebellion's fighters almost didn't make it to the exhaust port at all. And even when they struggled, the Empire still didn't respond competently. Lieutenant Tanbris reported directly to Grand Moff Tarkin during the battle that Rebel fighters were evading turbolaser fire through unconventional maneuvers. Tarkin refused to authorize additional defensive measures. The Death Star reportedly had 5,000 TIE fighters in its hangars. Against a Rebel assault force of fewer than 32 ships, Tarkin declined to mass deploy them. Imperial officer Cassio Taggi had previously warned Tarkin that sufficient analysis of the Death Star's technical specifications might allow the rebellion to identify and exploit a reactor weakness. Tarkin dismissed that warning too. So the sequence at Yavin runs like this. An Imperial engineer secretly sabotages the station's design. A Rebel spy network obtains the technical readouts. An Imperial officer correctly identifies the threat and warns Command. Command ignores him. The battle begins. A second officer reports that fighters are evading the station's primary defensive weapons. Command ignores him too. the station is destroyed. At every decision point, the Empire had the information it needed to prevent its own defeat. It chose not to act on it. The casualty math makes this even more stark. The rebellion lost 26 pilots and 13 astromech droids. The Empire lost approximately 2.35 million personnel in a single detonation. Exchange ratio: roughly 1 rebel pilot for every 57,000 Imperial personnel killed. By conventional military accounting, that ratio is catastrophic for the Empire, not for the rebels. The rebellion lost essentially its entire operational pilot corps and still scored a decisive strategic victory. The only honest military conclusion is that Yavin wasn't a rebel triumph. It was an imperial self-destruction that the rebels happened to be present for. 3 years later, the Empire came the closest it would ever get to ending the war cleanly, and fumbled it in under 5 minutes. The rebellion's base was on Hoth. Echo Base held approximately 24,000 personnel, including much of the Alliance's command structure, General Riken, Admiral Akbar, and virtually the entire operational and political leadership of the movement. The Empire located the base. A fleet appeared in the system. Admiral Ozzel, commanding the Imperial fleet, exited hyperspace too close to the Hoth system. Rebel sensors detected the fleet immediately. Evacuation began before Imperial ground forces could establish any blocking screen. Vader's on-screen assessment was characteristically blunt. He came out of hyperspace too close to the system. He is as clumsy as he is stupid. Ozzel was force-choked to death via hologram. Captain Piet was promoted on the spot. A competent approach looked like this: exit hyperspace outside sensor range, deploy a complete blockade before the rebellion detects anything, then either demand surrender or engage ground forces against a garrison with no escape route. If Ozzel had done that, the entire rebel command structure, every significant political and military leader the Alliance possessed, was sitting on a frozen planet with nowhere to go. The war could have ended at Hoth. Instead, the ground assault that followed was an Imperial tactical victory. Echo Base was captured or destroyed, but a strategic failure. The people who mattered escaped. Transports punched through the Imperial blockade, using ion cannon fire to disable Star Destroyers long enough to create gaps, and the rebel leadership got out. The Hoth sequence reveals something important about why the Empire kept failing, even when it was winning. Vader executed Ozzel for incompetence, which was arguably justified. But the pattern of executing officers for failure created a command culture where admitting uncertainty or reporting bad news upward became genuinely dangerous. An officer who had concerns about his hyperspace approach vector at Hoth wouldn't have flagged them. The calculus was simple: report a problem and risk appearing incompetent, say nothing and maybe it works out. The Empire's command structure punished honesty, so honesty disappeared. Tarkin's refusal to act on Tambris's and Tag's warnings at Yavin wasn't unique Imperial arrogance. It was the logical product of a culture where admitting problems was treated as a career-ending failure. The Tarkin Doctrine, using fear as the primary instrument of governance rather than conventional force projection, produced exactly this result. Officers who survived in that system were those who projected confidence regardless of reality. That's not a military virtue. That's a selection mechanism for producing disasters. Real-world military history offers a recognizable template for what happened to the Empire. The United States and Vietnam possessed overwhelming conventional superiority, advanced air power, numerical ground forces, industrial dominance, and still lost a decade-long conflict to a force operating without comparable technology or logistics. The British faced a similar paradox during the American Revolution. The most professional military force of the 18th century, defeated by a coalition that couldn't field a comparable regular army. Technological and numerical superiority doesn't automatically translate to victory against a dispersed, ideologically motivated opponent who refuses to fight on the superior force's preferred terms. The Empire isn't the first superpower to discover this, just the most dramatic example of it. The rebellion's actual advantages had nothing to do with ships or money. Their intelligence network was real and functional. the Bothan spy network acquired Death Star 2's location and operational status, which was the intelligence that made Endor possible. Mon Mothma's political connections sustained funding from sympathetic system governments and private donors when the Alliance had no tax base to draw on. And the rebellion's decentralized command structure, which looked like a weakness, actually made it resilient in ways the Empire's rigid hierarchy wasn't. Destroy one rebel cell and others continued operating. Destroy the Emperor and the entire Imperial command structure went offline simultaneously. Imperial stormtroopers were, at best, professional soldiers serving an occupying power in systems that increasingly resented the occupation. Rebel fighters were volunteers, motivated by something the Empire couldn't purchase or conscript. That asymmetry in motivation doesn't show up in any force ratio, but it was operationally real. Volunteers who believe in what they're fighting for don't break as easily under pressure. None of this explains Yavin, though. None of it fully explains Endor. For those, you need to examine the one variable that doesn't fit cleanly into conventional military modeling. The Force is the analyst's problem in this conflict, an unquantifiable variable that breaks every model. Luke Skywalker's shot into the Death Star exhaust port at Yavin wasn't a conventional targeting solution. He deactivated his targeting computer and relied on Force guidance for a 2-meter aperture at combat speed under active defensive fire. Han Solo's last-second intervention, clearing Darth Vader from Luke's attack run, wasn't tactically predictable. You can't plan for those moments. You can't build them into a doctrine. But the Force was also the Empire's problem, specifically Darth Vader's personal obsession with finding his son. Vader diverted resources, attention, and strategic focus toward locating Luke Skywalker throughout the war. That's not a military objective. It's a personal one. Imperial assets that could have been deployed toward neutralizing the rebel command structure were instead directed toward a Force-based family drama. And at Endor, Vader's decision to turn against Palpatine and save Luke ended the Empire's central command in a single moment, not because the rebellion outfought the Empire, but because its supreme military enforcer prioritized his son over the war. The Force shaped this conflict, and its influence wasn't neutral, but it bent both ways. And the direction it ultimately bent was away from the side that was supposed to win. Endor is where all of these threads converge, and where the Emperor's strategic thinking becomes most visibly detached from anything resembling rational military planning. Palpatine's operational concept at Endor was this: allow rebel intelligence to discover the Death Star 2's location and learn that its shield was incomplete. Lure the entire rebel fleet into a trap. Destroy it with the Death Star 2 and a waiting Imperial armada. Simultaneously confront Luke Skywalker personally and either convert him to the dark side or kill him. All of this, managed by the Emperor himself from aboard the Death Star 2. The Imperial fleet was positioned defensively near the Death Star, rather than in offensive formation, which meant when the rebel fleet arrived and realized the station was fully operational, they were already inside the trap before Akbar's famous recognition of what was happening. That part of the plan worked. The rebel fleet was engaged at close range, unable to easily withdraw. What Palpatine's plan didn't adequately account for, the shield generator protecting the Death Star was a ground-based installation on Endor's forest moon. A small rebel commando team landed on that moon. The shield generator was destroyed by a ground assault that succeeded partly because the local Ewok population assisted the rebel operatives in neutralizing the Imperial garrison. The most powerful military installation in the galaxy was defeated, in part because its ground defense was beaten by a primitive indigenous species with bows, spears, and log traps. That isn't a knock on the Ewoks. That's an indictment of Imperial force allocation. Palpatine staked the entire war, the full rebel fleet, his personal presence aboard the Death Star, Darth Vader, and the second Death Star, on a single engagement with no fallback position. The plan required the Death Star 2 to remain shielded. The shield required a garrison that held. The garrison didn't hold. More critically, Palpatine's confidence that the outcome was certain wasn't based on conventional military intelligence. It was based on force prescience. He genuinely believed his ability to see through the Force made the outcome predetermined. That substituted spiritual certainty for operational contingency planning. When Vader threw him into the reactor shaft, there was no succession plan, no secondary command authority, no protocol for Imperial fleet operations without central leadership. The fleet, still numerically superior, still engaged with the rebel force, disintegrated without orders. A military commander who bets everything on a single engagement with a divine guarantee of success isn't a strategist. He's a gambler who stopped calculating odds. The Galactic Civil War ended not because the rebels outbuilt the Empire, outfunded it, or outfought it in any sustained conventional sense. At Endor, the rebellion deployed 150 to 200 capital ships. The Empire's warship inventory ran to approximately 1.7 million vessels total. The ratio at the war's final battle was still absurdly asymmetric. The rebellion won anyway, not because the numbers changed, but because the entity those numbers were supposed to serve had rotted through from the inside. The Tarkin Doctrine produced officers who couldn't report bad news. The promotion system produced commanders who were loyal rather than competent, Ozzel being the most consequential example. The Death Star program consumed resources that could have funded conventional force projection sufficient to simply overwhelm the rebellion through attrition, and instead produced a weapon with a 2-meter design flaw that an embedded saboteur built in from the start. The Empire's Supreme Commander spent the war's final act playing force chess, while his military staff managed a battle they were never given permission to actually win on military terms. Asymmetric warfare has a long history of producing counterintuitive outcomes. The side with overwhelming conventional superiority frequently overestimates how that superiority translates to strategic results against a dispersed opponent that refuses to engage conventionally. The British knew this after America. The United States relearned it in Vietnam. The Empire never learned it at all, which is arguably why the lesson was so definitive. The rebellion survived long enough. That was their actual strategy. Not to outmanufacture the Empire, not to outspend it, not to defeat it in a single conventional engagement, but to survive, stay mobile, avoid annihilation, and wait for the Empire's internal contradictions to mature into external failures. Hit and run raids, covert logistics through hostile space, decentralized command that couldn't be decapitated in a single strike. They were still hopelessly outgunned at the end. They were outgunned at Yavin, at Hoth, at Endor. The numbers never got close. But at Yavin, a sabotaged weapon and an arrogant commander provided the opening. At Hoth, a single officer's blunder preserved the command structure that would fight at Endor. At Endor, a supreme commander who confused force confidence for operational certainty left his most critical installation defended by a garrison that a commando team and a tribal society dismantled in a single night. The rebellion didn't win because they were stronger. They won because every time the Empire had the opportunity to end them, someone in Imperial command made the wrong call. And the culture that produced that command made different decisions structurally impossible. A system built to project fear stops being able to hear the truth. Officers who might have saved the Empire at Yavin, at Hoth, at Endor, chose silence over honesty because the cost of honesty was death. Tag warned Tarkin. Tanbris warned Tarkin. The Empire had the intelligence to defend the Death Star and chose not to use it. That's not bad luck. That's the logical endpoint of a doctrine that treats intimidation as a substitute for competence. The lesson isn't that underdogs always win. They mostly don't. The rebellion was genuinely exceptional in its intelligence network, its ideological motivation, its decentralized resilience, and yes, in the force variables that no military model can fully account for. Strip out those advantages and the Empire wins, probably at Hoth, possibly earlier. But those advantages were enough to survive. Survival was enough, because the Empire was capable of defeating itself, and given enough time, it did exactly that. The powerful can always destroy themselves. The precondition is that someone smaller has the discipline to still be standing when it happens. Subscribe for more stories like this.